Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our course breakdown for this week's Memorial Tournament. Gonna go through Muirfield Village Golf Club and everything you need to know about this week's venue to go out there, get your research started, make some of your outright bets, pick some of your players for DFS lineups, and some of your key stats, comp courses that I'm looking at around the PGA Tour. So gonna keep this quick, concise, to the point, all the information that you need, and no extra fluff out there for you. So let's go ahead and hop right on in. Muirfield Village is up in Dublin, Ohio, just outside of Columbus, and is one of the harder tracks on all the PGA Tour. In fact, in 2023, it was the second hardest golf course that we saw, including the major championships. So expect a scoring average over par, and even with some weather supposed to soften up the course a little bit on Wednesday, they've got a sub-air system out there to pull a lot of that moisture out. So this place routinely plays firm and fast. It's got some of the gnarliest rough that we have on the PGA Tour, and you're going to see that reflected with the winning score this week, and of course, the cut line and your scoring averages. But in terms of your setup, it's a par 72. So normally par 72s can be a little bit easier because of the 4 par 5s, but because of how brutally difficult this course is, even as a par 72, it'll routinely play 1, even 2 strokes over par. Some of that is the length. It is a relatively beefy golf course at nearly 7,600 yards, but mostly because of the green complexes, which tend to be extremely firm, like I mentioned, and also run extremely quick in terms of your stimp meter reading, and aren't all that large. They're about 5,000 square foot on average. The rough, because it is so penal out there, is about half a stroke penalty every time you miss the fairway around Muirfield Village, is where you get a lot of that penalty, whether it's the misses off the tee or even the misses into greens, where you have one of the lowest green regulation averages of any of the golf courses on the PGA Tour. So even your best players out there are going to miss fairways. There are a few creeks that run through the property that can lead to penalty shots, and even your best approach players are going to only hit like 65, maybe 70% of their greens. So that around the green comes into play for every single player, and is why the winning score is usually kept in check. A few things to note is that we have bent grass from tip to toe, so whether it's your greens, collars, approaches, you name it, all that is going to be some sort of bent grass. The rough can be a little bit more variable. It's mostly that Kentucky bluegrass that gives the course that dark green color, or a little bit of fescue that can get a little bit longer. So this golf course is mostly bent. We're going to be looking at those metrics. We're going to be looking at around the green and putting stats, but that's it for the course conditions. It's a Jack Nicklaus design, was redesigned back there, and I believe 2020 is when they finished that, and the golf course has gone significantly longer since then, and has also played a little bit more difficult. To give you some of the stat averages, we'll hop over to Bet the Number now, and give you some of the stats over the last 3 events here. So for these averages over here, we're pulling the metrics from 2023, 2022, and 21, to give you a little bit of a larger sample of what to expect here. So all of these golf tournaments happened after the renovation, so after they added that length and difficulty to this track, and you'll see what I was talking about before. So your green average is probably the most notable metric here, where it is only 55.7%, and last year it was close to 50% for the field, and this was a signature event, so it's not like we have some slappies teamed up around this golf course. This sort of event, it's Jack's place, right? Everyone shows up to this golf course, and only about half the greens were hit. So even if you are an elite tier player gaining about 20% green regulation to the field, which would be one of, if not the best player in the field if they could accomplish that, that is still going to lead to a lot of around the green shots. And because it only has a 54% scrambling rate, that's where you make all of those bogeys out there. So your fairway average is actually higher than your tour average, quite large landing areas when it comes to your off the tee play, but because it's a little bit firmer, they play smaller than they are in actuality. So it's really important to be missing the rough, missing those creeks around the golf course, because of how big a penalty there is. Your 3-putt percentage is a little bit lower than your tour average. With only 5,000 square foot greens, it's pretty tough to 3-putt unless you're on the complete opposite side of the green. Your birdie average is lower than tour average. Your bogey average is actually pretty in check, right? 3.35 per round, but what they don't include on this is the double bogeys, the triple bogeys that you see at this golf course, which are extremely prevalent around Muirfield Village. We could take a look at some of the off the tee metrics where you can see it's about an average golf course in terms of Bomber's Paradise. There are 15 driver holes, it says. I think it's truly closer to 14 because there's 4 par 3s out there. You're not really going to hit 3 woods around Muirfield Village, but at the same time, it's a lot more about your accuracy around here than it is your distance distance. If you're hitting the ball, spraying it off the tee and hitting it a long way, a lot of times there are golf courses that'll allow for that, not so much when you have that 4-inch rough like we have here at Muirfield Village. Some spots where it's going to get closer to 5.5, even 6 inches long. I would rather have 210 yards in and be in the fairway than be 165 out in the rough. It's that's not always the case, by the way. There are plenty of golf courses where I'd rather have that length. I'd rather be in the rough than further back in the fairway, but Muirfield Village is the opposite end of that spectrum. So that's why it's only a 5.6 out of 10 when it comes to the Bomber's Paradise, which was great to see because that's kind of where I have it on this kind of week. Your approach shot distribution is mostly in that, let's say 175 to 225 is a lot more prevalent than what we're used to seeing. And this 125 to 175 yard range is also a little bit more prevalent. The shorter shots don't come in very handy, mostly only going to be on the par 5s that you have at this golf course. And you are going to have your fair share of 226 yard shots, but those are all going to be on the par 5. So it's definitely a longer course. You're going to see more long irons in play for these players, but plenty of holes we're going to have a mid iron or even a short iron in, which kind of takes it away from just only looking at the long iron proximity buckets. If you do so, right, you're going to miss out on some of the shorter par 4s. Some of your bombers are going to be hitting it further than your average player, so they're going to have a lot more in that 150 to 175 yard range. So it's a pretty balanced approach profile. I'd say if anything, you slightly de-emphasize the shorter clubs, and then when it comes to this 175 to 225 range, that's probably the one that I'm personally focusing on a little bit more. Now let's take a look at the golf course, go hole by hole, give you a taste of what these players are facing. So here's hole number 1, and hole 1 is not the handshake you'd hope for. It's nearly 500 yards, it's a par 4, a little bit of dogleg action from left to right, which makes hitting this fairway difficult when it gets firm and fast. Now I think the rain coming through Wednesday will make it a little bit easier out here on hole number 1, but it also means that the rough is going to be a little bit more dense with that added moisture. So you can see it in front, there's a little bit of a shaved off fairway area, so they do give you room to bounce up balls onto the green, but everything to the side and past this green complex is that deep, gnarly rough. Hole 2 is 458. This is a pretty straightforward par 4. There's not that much going on here in terms of your design. You do have the creek down the right side, which could come into play with your second shot, but only for those right side pin locations where your dispersion pattern is going to include that hazard. Hole 3 is 390 yards, so it is one of the fewer shorter par 4s on property. Now, everyone's going to lay up here except for Jordan Spieth. A few years ago, Jordan decided to hit it up here on the tee boxes and took that route in terms of getting to a birdie. I believe Hovland did it once or twice last year too en route to his win, so perhaps more people start to take that strategy. If you do, you can leave like a 30-40 yard chip up to this green, but the more prudent play, the more common play is going to be to take less than driver to this corner. Hole 4 is 210 yards, so it's your first par 3. It's a longer hole, especially towards the back pin locations, which can play close to 250 yards, especially into the wind. Hole 5 is 541, so this is your first par 5, but it's a lot trickier than it looks on paper. You pretty much can't hit driver off the tee here unless you're okay with hitting it to the rough on the right, which you will see a few players do. Some will take a more aggressive line and just try and hit it over here to this right side, but the more common play will be to hit it to the corner here. If you're going for the green at 2, it's about a 250 yard carry to the green, which is pretty daunting. It's not impossible, especially if it's a calmer day around Muirfield Village, but kind of like the last hole, if it plays into the wind, could be an absolute brute. And if that's the case, you're going to see a ton of layups out here to the right side. Hole 6 is 455. This is another mid-length par 4. This water really doesn't come into play at all unless you have this back left pin though. Hole 7 is 586, so it is your second par 5. I would say that this one is a little bit more gettable in 2. You do have to have some length to get there. Anyone that can carry it 300 through the air is going to get up in between these cross bunkers and leave themselves about 250 yards to the complex, which again isn't a complete given, but most players should be able to get that done. And with the lack of water here, there's a lot less risk in going for it in 2. Hole 8 is 200 yards, your second par 3. This one is surrounded by super deep bunkers, also some gnarly rough like you have on almost every other hole. Hole 9 is 417, one of the shorter par 4s. Not one that you can really take on in terms of a driver though, right? Most players are going to lay back, leave themselves a full wedge, because if you do take a driver, first off, the fairway narrows off significantly the closer you get down to this creek, and also if you miss in the rough, it makes it almost impossible to hold this green with how firm that they're going to play. Hole 10 is 472, so a longer par 4. So if they have them on split tees, I'm not sure what they're going to do quite yet. If you are starting at hole 10, it's not a whole lot easier than what you had at hole number 1. 11 is 591, so a par 5. This one is reachable in 2 if you're a longer player. If you can force it down there past these bunkers, you're going to have a more realistic chance to get there. But if it's not playing firm and fast, if you're not getting that rollout in the fairway, it is only one that the long bombers are going to get to. 12 is 180 yards, so shorter par 3, but the green is very complex. It's kind of like 12 at Augusta. Honestly, reminds me a lot of that. You've got the water in front. The bunkers are in similar placements as well. And though it's shorter, it's one of the harder par 3s on the course. 13 is 456. This is a dogleg from right to left. It's not a very severe one, though. The mist to the right can be troublesome, especially as these trees will be much fuller now as opposed to when these pictures were taken in the fall. And this green complex, though relatively simple from the overhead view, is well protected by bunkers and some rough. 14 is 360, so another one of the shorter par 4s, but just like the other one that was 390, there's no incentive to hit driver here, right? If you take it, this water really comes into play, and if you do decide to try and hit it up towards the green, really you're only going to see that if they move up the tee box. So if you just set the target one right in front of this green complex, you can see it's 326 to get there, which would require a downwind tee shot. It would also require slightly firmer fairways to bounce up onto the complex. And with all the risk involved, you're only going to see a few players, if they move up the tee box, even take it on. So if they decide to move it up, it's more so like a 305-yard carry to get here. I know Cam Davis ended up taking it on here at one point and ended up hitting the green. So it is possible, but a lot of that depends on the tee box location. 15 is 561, so this is another par 5. I believe your shortest of the bunch, or maybe second shortest, but because the water isn't as much in play as your first par 5, you are going to see people go for it in 2. 16 is 200 yards. It's your last par 3, water in play down the left. One of the most severe greens on the entire course. So though it doesn't look that crazy from the overhead view, there's a ton of slope over here from the back right to the front left. A lot of that for drainage into this lake, but makes for extremely difficult up and downs if you bail out to the right side. And obviously a lot of people are going to do that with the water to the left. 17 is 484. It is a brutal par 4. The tee shot is a little bit more straightforward than some of the other holes, right? It doesn't really shape in one direction or the other. You just want to keep it short of some of these bunkers and out of the one on the right, because if you do hit it in that bunker, you're going to have a real dicey second shot. This creek comes into play if you miss the fairway at hole 17, and you're going to see a lot of people lay up and try and take it on with their third shot for par. 18 is 480 yards, so your finishing hole is even more brutal than the one before. The tee shot isn't as straightforward because it does camber from left to right, and the slope also takes you to the left. So this creek down to the left, you've seen this creek in play for quite a few holes already. It doesn't look like it's that much in play, but believe it or not, you'll have guys that hit the fairway with their tee shot that bounce into this aquatic penalty area. So a lot of the sloping at this course makes it even more difficult than it should be. And in terms of tee shot, this is maybe the most difficult on all of the PGA Tour. Everything is working against you here. You essentially have to hit a fade off that left side and a very hard fade to hit it up against the slope to hold the fairway. You're going to see a ton of people hit it in the left stuff, even more bailout to the right, and the bailout isn't any easier. You've got trees that are going to be a lot more full this time of year. It's a long iron shot out of that 4 or 5 inch rough to a green complex that is just as severe as some of the par 3s. Now that we see in the golf course, let's go through our key stats for this week. So once again, over here in Bet the Number, use code Gsluke, by the way, if you're signing up for a discount and free trial membership over there. And we'll go through what they've got for a model, then something I'm going to add on top of that. So one thing to know about this golf course is that it's a second shot golf course. So not only does Bet the Number have shots gained approach on there and weighted quite heavily out there in their modeling. By the way, if you want to see exactly how much they're weighing everything, go ahead and click this tab right here. I don't want to give away all the goods for free here in the live stream. That wouldn't be right out there for Bet the Number. But click that, you can see exactly how much they're using each of these key stats. So they've got regular shots gained approach in there and a few proximity buckets. So they've got this 100 to 175 yard range, which you'll get for most of your par 4s out there, the ones that aren't 500 plus yards. And then this 175 to 250 range is where almost all of your par 3s are. Those really beefy par 4s, right? You're going to get an approach in this range and on the par 5s. So I like like that they're adding even more emphasis on these approach buckets and more specifically ignoring the super short shots, right? Outside of the 2 sub 400 yard par 4s, you're not going to hit a wedge at this golf course, right? There's 2 of them. If you lay up on a par 5, you can add on a few there. But if you're taking on this golf course like your elite tier players will, right, going for those par 5s and 2, you're going to have like 2 of those shots the entire day. So I like that they added some extra emphasis where it matters this week. And just to give you some of the poppers in both ranges, obviously Scotty, one of the best players, whichever proximity bucket that we're looking at, but Russell Henley, really good with those mid irons to some of the shorter irons out there. Shane Lowry, Tom Hoagie, Benny Ann, all players that kind of stand out there. You can see the rest of the list, a few guys that you'd expect to see, like a JT, Wyndham Clark, just really solid iron players to begin with. But if you go over here to this 175 to 250 range, you're going to see a few other names that show up, right? So Will Zalatoris really likes a difficult long iron golf course, so not a surprise to see him up there. Same thing with Hideki. He's kind of known for that out there on tour. But Jake Knapp shows up once again. He was pretty decent in the other category, was up there in the top 25. Guys like Xander, Sibu, Alex Noren, this is where they're showing up. Ludwig, Scotty Scheffler, once again, elite tier in this long iron category. So on top of just looking at your recent form, maybe your last 12 or last 24 measured rounds with your approach play, I think that looking at these specific proximity buckets, especially because Bet the Number, their team are looking at it. Of course, guys, they work with strategy with players on the PGA Tour week in, week out. They know these golf courses better than anyone else out there. If they're looking at 175 and in, if they're looking at 175 to 250, then I'm going to be doing that myself this week. They know a whole lot more about these golf courses than any other piece of content that you'll see. So if there's anyone to trust out there, it's these sort of guys. They're also looking at around the green a little bit differently this week. So they're just looking at bunkers and rough. And while there are a few fairway shots that you're going to have to hit around the green, that's only going to be if you're laying up or you're just hitting it in front of the green. Almost every other miss that you have, which is a vast majority of your misses around this golf course, are either in greenside bunkers or in that deep, gnarly rough. Guys that have stood out in that category are Victor Hovland, Colin Morikawa are extremely skilled at around the green shots out of that deep rough, and Victor Hovland won this golf tournament last year. So he's also a pretty decent bunker player. He's not as good out of the bunkers as he is out of that deep rough, but here are a few other players that excel at this style of around the green play. So you've got Steven Yeager up there, guys like Tom Hoagie, who these two, they're not the worst around the green players, but they're certainly not standouts, right? If you include the fairway stuff, but if you take out the fairway around the green shots, they're some of the best players on tour. So you would expect these two guys in particular to get a pretty big bonus out there. Scotty Scheffler showing up once again, but there's really not a stat category that we could make where Scotty Scheffler is not going to show up towards the top. Alex Noren, pretty intriguing name up there. I'd say Keegan Bradley, despite his poor form, kind of good to see that he's been solid in those two sort of around the green shots. You got Mackenzie Hughes, Denny McCarthy up there. It's worth noting with Denny, his course history here is ridiculous. 5th place there 2 years ago, 2nd place runner-up last year to Victor Hovland in a playoff. This is the one category where he really pops off, right? His ball striking is not elite, which is kind of backwards from what we'd expect at Muirfield Village Golf Club, but he's really good on bent grass putting. That's another stat you could add into your model for this week. And then this around the green is really where he separates himself. So I would not expect him to go out there 3 years in a row and finish top 5. I think this is probably the letdown year for Denny McCarthy, but at the same time, this is why we're looking at this sort of around the green stat, right? If there's anything that would point us to Denny and what he's done the last 2 years, it's the putting. We know that. This is not really a putting first sort of golf course, though, but that around the green play, when he misses greens and it's in a bunker or that gnarly rough, he's one of the best players in the world. So maybe that's why. That combined with the putting, why he's getting to the top of the leaderboards here at Memorial. Jordan Spieth, really skilled there, not a surprise. Same thing with Harris English, JT. You kind of expect to see him up there. But Adam Schenk, at least to me, I wasn't expecting that. Taylor Pendrith, too. He's not the most consistent around the green player, but out of these two sort of surfaces, he's been a plus player, as you can see. Seamus Power, Chris Goddard, also players that are plus players in that sort of bucket. I also added driving accuracy percentage. Now, in my personal modeling for like my DFS stuff this week, I'm going to be using good drive percentage, which is the amount of times that you can hit a green regulation after missing the fairway or even hitting the fairway. It doesn't really matter where you hit your tee shot, as long as you still give yourself a shot to hit the green. So what that means is not missing in the creek, right? Not missing in the spot that you quote unquote can't miss out there. It's not missing into the trees, right? Just keeping yourself relatively in play. Maybe it's a fairway bunker that you hit it in. Maybe it's the intermediate. Maybe you're just a step or two into the rough this week where it's not as gnarly as it can get in some other spots. That's another way to take on this golf course, because if you've taken a look at some of the leaderboards, this is where Morikawa shows up, right? His course history has been really good here. Last year, before he withdrew, he was in the top 5 of this golf tournament. So obviously played a lot better than you'd expect from a withdraw. Did miss the cut there in 2022, but second place in 2021, won the Workday charity event at this golf course. So it's not the Memorial Tournament, but he won the other event that they've played at this golf course since the renovation. I think a guy that really fits this kind of track, and you've seen that. You saw that last year before the withdrawal. That happened because of back injury, by the way, before he went out there and was playing on Sunday. So just a heartbreaking situation if you had him for DFS last year. You had somebody in the top 5 withdrawal before the round on Sunday, but I wouldn't hold that against him. He clearly plays these golf courses well, and I think a lot of that is because he keeps himself in play. And then Colin Morikawa, though the stats haven't really bared it out this year, from the logic test, from the eye test, we know he's one of the best long iron players in the game. That's why he shows up at these big time events. That's why he showed up at the Charles Schwab PGA Championship. And frankly, I think he's a really good fit for this golf course too. So some of the more accuracy first kind of players, what we're looking to pair up here is accuracy off the tee and long iron play. So you can see here, Siwoo Kim checks both boxes. Obviously, Scotty Scheffler does too. But Shane Lowry, perhaps a little bit of a sneaky play there. Even guys like Lucas Glover, JT Poston are half decent when it comes to their long iron play. So I would classify a lot of these guys as sleepers, because I think a lot of people are going to look for your elite tier bomber this week. Really good long iron player, really good around the green player. The other way to get it done is to be more precise off the tee, but just to clinically take apart the golf course with your long irons. And you've seen a lot of players find success, including winners at this event, right? Billy Horschel, that is exactly how he went out there and won this golf event. It's how Denny McCarthy, for example, right? He had a really good week with his long irons when he went out there and finished in second last year. It's how those sort of players get there with the long irons and then that precise play off the tee. Lee Hodge is showing up, okay. Tom Hoagie, once again, right? He was really good around the green as well. We know he's a good long iron player too. So I think that he's going to be intriguing for this kind of week. Tommy Fleetwood, been hitting a bunch of fairways. Jordan Spieth, surprisingly hitting fairways himself. The iron play has been horrendous for him though. So he's probably not the best play of this week if we're being honest. And that's coming from a Jordan Spieth stan saying that. So that hurt me to say, but it's true, right? Tom Kim over there at 60-1. He's a decently accurate player, getting a lot better with the ball striking lately too. So though the stats, you can see over the last, I think this is 32 rounds that they're using here on Bet the Number, the stats aren't as favorable. If you just look at the last few events, I mean, look at this. 10 strokes tee to green at the RBC Canadian. 4.4 strokes tee to green over there at the Charles Schwab. PGA Championship Elite Tier Field still gained 3.5 strokes tee to green. Putting's been a lot better too. It's been a little bit hit or miss, right? He's had weeks where he's gained 3 strokes, 2.7 strokes. He had a few weeks where he's lost strokes to the field as well. But this tee to green play, at least over the last 3 events, has been trending in the right direction, right? Each week getting slightly better. And if he can, do what he did last week, I mean, the 4th at the Canadian was a fantastic finish for Tom Kim. He could take on this kind of golf course. He's hitting fairways. He's a decent long iron player. It's maybe not the best course fit, but it's one that he could still get the job done. So because of the form, I'll be at least monitoring Tom Kim this week, potentially trying to take him at low ownership in DFS. I think that's where I'd want to get my exposure to him. Keegan Bradley showing up again. He was another around the green popper. He's decently accurate off the tee. Same thing with Xander Schauffele coming in off the major championship victory. I think he'll get quite a bit of steam this week. Billy Horschel, of course, won this event back there in 2022. His form isn't nearly as good as it was back there a few years ago, but he's been a lot better lately than what we've seen for quite some time. In fact, had the win over there at Corrales Puticana. His way to success is, of course, bent grass putting. That's always going to be one of his better stat categories, but it's that driving accuracy in the long iron play, which recently has not been a huge positive for him, but historically is how he's went out there, contended at API before. He's been out there and won at this golf course. If he can win at those kind of tracks, he can definitely win again this week, especially with that win just 5 starts ago out there on his record. And then that's probably it for the key stats, guys. I think putting still has to be somewhat included in your modeling, right? Because that's how guys like Denny McCarthy have shown up here before. Even Harris English has had a decent track record at some of the comp courses that I'm looking at for a Muirfield Village. Putting is still somewhat included, but it is de-emphasized compared to some of the other stats out there. Tee to green play is the most correlated thing to success around Muirfield Village, and I think if you were looking at putting a ton this week, you'd probably not be putting enough emphasis over there on that tee to green play. So my number 1 key stat this week is the second shot, right? Approach play, as you'd expect for most tournaments. But number 2 is around the green, which is definitely a little bit of a sidetrack compared to what we normally have. 3 is off the tee play, and that is definitely skewed towards driving accuracy accuracy this week over that distance. And then lastly is that shots gained putting. So I think even off the tee in general, maybe a little bit less important this week than most. It's about that approach play. It's about saving yourself when you inevitably miss these greens. That is going to take you to the top of the leaderboard. And now for a few comp courses for this week. So first off, we got the Masters Tournament, Augusta National Golf Club, which frankly, I think a lot of the inspiration from Muirfield came from. These difficult green complexes, a lot of the sloping that you have, that deep green rough that you have, also the real firmness that you get around Muirfield is, I think, a lot modeled after what you had at the Masters. Not a huge surprise given Jack Nicklaus, right? One of your, well, first off, greatest player of all time, but somebody who's not a stranger to winning there at Augusta National. I think this would be a really good course fit. So first off, you got the large driving corridors. That is the same across both golf courses. It's much more about that second shot than anything. And because the around the green shots are so penal, you can see the scrambling average pretty similar to what we had for this week. Your green regulation average actually even a little bit higher than what we have at this golf tournament. I would say the Masters is almost like an easier version of what we get here at the Memorial. The around the green shot's a little bit of a different character. At Augusta, it's more so off of fairway grass, right? More of those tight lie around the green shots. This week, it's more of that deep rough, the bunkers that you're worrying about. So I think that's the clear differentiator between the two events. But from the scoring perspective, bogeys per round, birdies per round, etc., a ton of crossover that we can have. And both are par 72s as well, which I don't think is something you can sleep on. Another tough par 72, well, is down here in the state of Florida, right down here in the Sunshine State where I'm from, an event that I love going to year in and year out because it is one of the most difficult, the most demanding tests that these players will face. It's got the long, gnarly rough just like you have this week. Around the green, a very similar character. You've got those deep bunkers, gnarly rough around the green, not as many fairway areas, kind of like what you'd have at the Masters, which I think gives it a better feel for the around the green shots. I'd say that the greens at API aren't as severe as what you have this week, which is why it might play slightly easier than what you have up there in Muirfield. But what you get at API that differentiates it, that can make the golf course play more difficult in terms of scoring, is the weather, right? South Florida weather, especially over there in the spring, can get pretty windy, can get pretty blustery down there, whereas opposed up there in the Muirfield, normally it's pretty calm. Now, looking at some early forecasts for this week, it does look like Thursday and Friday might be pretty windy, but typically the API is more wind impacted than what you have at some of the other golf courses. So kind of like over there at the Masters, it was the round the green that's different. At this golf event, I think it's more so the weather that differentiates it. And then another really difficult, longer course. It's a par 71 this time, so not the par 72 that we're going to get this week. It would be the Genesis. And the differentiator here is the agronomy. Agronomy out there, you've got that Kikuyu, you've got Poa greens. Completely different than that Kentucky bluegrass and bent that we're going to get this week. But from the ball striking perspective, from how difficult the golf course is, a lot of parallels that can be made from that perspective. So different part of the country, obviously different climate, different time of year. There are enough differences that we could highlight for the next 5-10 minutes, but the approach profiles are eerily similar across the golf courses. Because it's over there in Cali that time of year, it tends to be pretty firm out there at the Genesis. And if you take a look at the champions, the players that have played well there, Masters have played well API or this week, a lot of players have won all 4 of them, or at least have like 2 or 3 of those. I think maybe the most surprising of all of them would be Billy Horschel, right? Who's been somehow a killer at 3 of those 4 golf courses. So it's the stat profile, it's the sort of golf that I think it favors, where it's not so much about being a bomber off the tee, it's more so just either being, I'd say a balanced game off the tee is what you have to have at all these tracks, but it's all about the approach play, right? The one thing you absolutely have to have, you don't have to be the best off the tee player, you have to be the best approach player to go out there and have a chance that week. So that's what I'll say about my comp courses. I have them in order, right? Number 1, Masters. Number 2 is API. Number 3 would be the Genesis. But really, any difficult par 72 would fit the bill for some comparison this week. Alrighty, golf fans, that is all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Before you're hopping out of here, go ahead and smash that like button for me, and also comment down below what you've got as your winning score. If you go ahead, get that winning score correct, you will win a free month of my Patreon page, where of course I'm posting all of the behind the scenes content for these golf tournaments. That'll include my projections, my research sheets over there for DFS and fantasy, my outright bets, prop betting for underdog and prize picks. All can be yours if you give me that winning score. So first off, the first person to guess a winning score is going to claim claim that number, and it won't be up for grabs anymore. So because of how difficult this golf course is, you better get your guesses in soon. So I'm going to go ahead and take -10 right off the bat. That'll be one number that's off the board, but go ahead, claim your guess down there in the comments, and appreciate your support, appreciate all your comments, likes here on the channel as per usual. Helps grow the channel, helps get it out there to even more people, helps me continue to give you guys this free content here on YouTube, and continue to just to grow in this space. I appreciate your support on the channel as per usual, guys. Best of luck out there with all of your exposure this week, and I'll be back tonight for our DFS and betting preview, going through some of my exposure and how I'm handling this signature event field.